Welcome back, everybody. So, today we're going to start looking at the strategies that terrorists use. And this is a good place to pick up as we've already started to think about how we define terrorism, different waves of terrorism, looking at motivations behind why people are willing to carry out terrorist attacks, looking at the political motivations behind terrorism, and also thinking about this idea of state sponsored and state terrorism. But today is our chance to really start looking into why terrorists take different actions, perhaps depending on the types of goals that they have. So there have been an attempt to try to break down and classify different strategies terrorists use to achieve their objectives. So we're going to look at a bunch today. We're going to look at attrition. We're going to look at provocation, spoiling. We're going to look at outbidding. We're going to look at intimidation, shows of strength, exacting specific concessions, and sowing disorder. And so I know your reading started to cover some of these, and we're going to expand on them more and then also add in a few more types of strategies that terrorists use. So this is what we're really going to focus on today. So let's just jump right in and start talking specifics about each one of these various strategies. We're going to start with attrition. So what is attrition as a strategy? Attrition really is an objective to try and wear down an enemy to get them to concede. So in this framework, we like to think about it as terrorist organizations carrying out consistent attacks, oftentimes over a prolonged period of time to encourage an enemy to give up on their particular objective and allow the terrorists to win. And the example we could think about here that's really good, I think, would be to consider the Taliban. This is a picture of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And it's been argued that they have tried to adopt and use a strategy of attrition against the United States. And so this fits in with this idea that oftentimes attrition has been argued to be a more effective strategy when the particular enemy is a foreign enemy, one that's an occupying force. And so we can see this has being more effective in these cases because it really becomes an issue of how long a particular group, in this case, say the United States, is willing to stay in Afghanistan to combat the Taliban, who are fighting in their own native land and want to try to force the United States out. And it's really this idea of we're thinking about the level, to determine the effectiveness of the strategy. We have to think about what the level of interest is for each party. So, for example, with the Taliban, these people live in Afghanistan, live in Pakistan, have invested interest in being there. The United States perhaps does not have as much of a commitment to remain in Afghanistan forever. And so it really becomes an issue in this case of how much the U.S. really wants to remain in Afghanistan, and if the Taliban really thinks that the United States doesn't have the desire to stay in Afghanistan long term, well, attrition may be an effective strategy. And then we also think about the effectiveness of this strategy based on the constraints on the ability of the occupying group to retaliate. So the United States is a democracy, for the most part, follows along with elements of the Geneva Convention, protection and of human rights, faces limitations in what it can do to try to respond to a group like the Taliban. They can't simply go in and try to massacre everyone that they want to, kill civilians, kill women, kill children. The U.S. has to engage in a constrained response. And so it's argued that attrition is more effective for a group, especially like the Taliban, when they know the U.S. faces limitations in their ability to respond and they can't engage in all-out warfare to try to root them out. So this lends an effectiveness to the attrition strategy. And then also we're thinking about the sensitivity to the costs of violence matter as well. So every time a U.S. serviceman or woman dies serving in Afghanistan, it really, again, brings up this question they ask in the media of why should the U.S. continue to be there? And these things are something that the Taliban is sensitive to, is aware of. It understands that the U.S. government has very little capacity to continue to maintain public support as more and more soldiers or people die in Afghanistan. So they're able to leverage this to their advantage. So this, I think, is a really good summary of how we can think about what attrition is. It's the idea of trying to wear down an enemy to get them to concede, using terrorist attacks to ultimately make them no longer have an interest in committing to their particular agenda, abandoning it. So now we'll think about provocation. So provocation we can think about is the idea that terrorists want to try to elicit an enemy response. And a good example of provocation is we can see with Al-Qaeda's attacks on 9/11. And Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden really wanted to try and spark a large-scale Islamic uprising against the West, and particularly the United States. And they thought what they could do is, if they were able to attack the United States, have the United States over-respond, commit forces, invade countries in the Middle East, what this would do is this would serve to then increase a group like Al-Qaeda's recruitment, increase the number of individuals who are willing to join and engage in terrorist attacks, and really hopefully bring a lot of people over to their cause by saying, look at what the United States has done. You should join our forces and support our objectives. And so that's really, in a lot of ways, what provocation has done. It's really they try to change the citizens' attitudes. So in this case, Al-Qaeda is trying to change the minds of people in the Middle East to be willing to join their organizations, engage in terrorist attacks, take up their particular cause. And so this, in a lot of ways, it's a recruitment tool. And so when we want to think about when is provocation successful, we have to think about what the hope of the terrorist organization is. And in this case, with the terrorist organization hopes that the government it attacks responds in what we would consider a moderate level of brutality. So what does that mean? Well, the terrorist organization oftentimes does not want to try and provoke a government that it thinks will engage in such an extreme response that they could potentially wipe out the terrorist organization. And we can think about this again based on the fact this is something that a lot of democratic governments are limited by. They can't go to the extreme to violate human rights, to torture, to do what some people have argued is necessary at times to completely eliminate terrorist organizations, because there's rule of law, there's protection of human rights, there's the idea that we shouldn't try to kill innocents to achieve a particular objective. So the government and the U.S. government in its response faces limitations. So they also don't want to engage in one of these attacks as they don't think a government's going to respond at all, right? Because if the U.S. doesn't respond by invading Iraq or Afghanistan, they don't do anything, well, they don't get that perceived overreaction that they want to have happen so they can change people's attitudes, increase the recruitment. So what they want is, they do want the government to respond and respond violently, but not so much that they potentially wipe out the organization, and on the flip side, so they don't respond at all and they don't get the enemy response they desire. So looking for that when governments are willing to, in the U.S. is willing to respond violently, but not over the top, that's seen as a way for them to successfully carry out their provocation strategy. So now let's think about spoiling. So spoiling is what we see when terrorists are trying to end negotiations. And this is an attempt to outmaneuver moderates. So we can see a good example of this issue of spoiling occurring in Israel during the 1990s. So in the 1990s, it's been argued, early 1990s, we were the closest there ever was to really coming to a peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. At the time, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was close to negotiations with Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. to try to bring about a peaceful solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. But before they could actually come to a full agreement, Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel, was actually killed by a far-right Israeli ideologue who really did not want there to be a solution and a peace agreement with the Palestinians because they believed that truly the land of Israel belonged to Israel and Palestine had no claims to it and there should not be any concessions made to the Palestinians. And this really ended the prospects of finding a peaceful settlement with the Palestinians. And so this may occur as well because if moderates from particular groups are willing to engage in the possibility of ending terrorist negotiation, those who are at the most extreme will try to use terrorism to try to spoil, hence the name, and end those negotiations to not allow the conflict to potentially be resolved. And so we can see various conditions when the prospects of spoiling are a successful strategy for terrorists. And so one of those is to really prevent to see spoiling as an effective strategy. Moderates need to appear strong. So in this case, moderates need to appear that they have the capacity to end negotiations, because what will happen is if terrorists are able to carry out attacks when it was perceived that moderates or other terrorist groups that had been willing to fight are no longer willing to do so, but these moderates can no longer control the fringes, the other side is going to be less willing to then continue to try to make a deal with the moderates, because they will say, you still don't have control of your extremist flanks, we don't trust you, and this is really a condition for when spoiling can end the possibility of peacefully ending negotiations. Another issue we see and strategy we see here is this idea of outbidding. And outbidding really is a struggle among and between terrorist groups for primacy. So we can see this with various groups in Palestine, whether it's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Hamas, Hezbollah, various groups struggling to try to establish themselves as the primary terrorist organization. And so groups will really attempt to outdo each other, and this can really lead to an escalation of violence because groups are competing for limited resources. They're competing for recruits. They're competing for money, especially if they're trying to get funding from outside sources. Like as we talked about, Iran's willing to fund and support terrorist organizations. Well, you want to, as a group, portray yourself as the most powerful, the one that really deserves the attention and the funding. And so this can lead to a competition between various terrorist groups. And we'll see where it can work. We can see hardline stances improve negotiating positions. So we'll see here, interestingly, that more and more groups will try to outdo each other to take the most hardline position, to depict themselves as the true champions of a particular cause. And this is where we really see outbidding starting to play out when these groups continue to try to outdo each other. So, we'll leave it at that. We're going to move on to intimidation. So for intimidation, here we're seeing terrorist groups that are trying to really gain the compliance of a particular of their population, and they want to try to demonstrate their worthiness to their particular cause and get the population on board with their particular objectives. So later in the course, we will watch the Battle of Algiers, and that focuses on the struggle between the National Liberation Front of Algeria, or the Front Libération Nationale, FLN, in Algeria, as they attempted to try to push the French out of Algeria in the 1950s. And the FLN really tried to engage in a degree of intimidation. They really tried to get the Algerian population on board with their objective, and they were willing to try to intimidate large elements of their own population to try to get them to support their objective of pushing the French out of Algeria. And we can see there really is some conditions for this to be successful. Are one is this idea of what we call weak states and rough terrain. And so this is the idea that there really is a limited capacity for the central government to push back against these terrorist organizations who are trying to carry out their particular attacks, so they can't respond and ultimately defeat the terrorist organizations, as well as this idea of rough terrain. And this is the idea that there are lots of places for terrorists to hide essentially from the central government if they're facing potential backlash from their attempts to intimidate, win over the population, and force the population to comply and ultimately support their particular objectives. So this is what we see when we talk about intimidation as a terrorist strategy. We also see terrorists have been willing to engage in what we call a show of strength, to really try to establish themselves, especially in terms of when they want to try to achieve a global brand and a global name recognition. And it's really an assertion of relevance. And we can see their desire to do so because they really want to try and gain media attention, right? Again, we come back to this idea of terrorism as a communication strategy, terrorists trying to win attention in people's minds to instill that fear. A show of strength is a way for them to do that. And one of those that really comes to mind, I think is a good example, is the attacks on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. In 1998, Al-Qaeda ended up attacking 2 U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, killing a number of American citizens. And the goal really here was to gain attention globally for the capacity of Al-Qaeda to strike at the United States, to really try to show them, they really wanted to try to show their power and ability to reach out and significantly harm the leading power in the world at that time. So this really is an attempt by these groups to gain notoriety, gain attention, and portray themselves as much stronger even than they may actually be. And it's also a recruitment mechanism. They see it as a way to, once they carry out an attack, they get large-scale media attention, more people are going to be potentially converted and brought over to their cause. And when is it most effective? Well, it's most effective when these groups hit symbolic targets as well. To really reach out and strike a U.S. embassy, a symbol of U.S. presence internationally, this is really seen as a way to demonstrate their capacity to exercise a show of strength. So what's the next one we want to look at? Well, we want to look at the idea of exacting specific concessions. So what does this mean? This is when terrorists want to try to achieve an immediate goal. And we can see this happening a lot and really started to occur frequently in the 1960s and 70s, where we would see hostage taking. The Palestinian Liberation Front managed to hijack a number of airplanes during this period to try to get concessions from the Israeli government. And they actually were able to do so at various points. They were able to force the Israeli government to be willing to give up certain prisoners that they and former terrorists who had been captured. And so they were able to use hijackings to gain media attention and also force the Israeli government to grant concessions by freeing previously captured terrorists. And the final one we're going to talk about here is this idea of sowing disorder. And this is important for thinking about terrorists really wanting to perhaps create chaos to promote their particular objective. And it's the idea that chaos benefits terrorists because in a lot of ways it has the capacity to discredit government. So when terrorists are able to carry out numerous attacks, are able to kill a lot of people, citizens begin to perhaps distrust their governments, or at least start to have real concerns that their governments have the capacity to combat terrorist organizations. And in some ways, this terrorists see this as potentially working to their advantage. In this picture here, we have the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland trying to sow disorder in Northern Ireland to weaken what they see as the credibility of the British government to respond, and really perhaps open up the opportunity for individuals to start to consider granting consent, wanting to push the government to grant concessions to terrorist organizations to end the violence, to end the chaos. And to see really when it works in a lot of ways, it's when the government has limited territorial control. So when governments have limited capacity, again, to effectively respond, control their particular territories, stop these groups from acting, well, it's going to then increase the sense of chaos and the sense of uncertainty in particular areas. So with that, I want to give you your first discussion question. Your other two discussion questions will be in the next lecture. So discussion question one, after we've started looking at all these strategies, is discussion question one: why do strategies matter for terrorist groups? Again, why do strategies matter for terrorist groups? Okay, so I'll post the next lecture as well, and you'll be looking at suicide bombing. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'll talk to you soon.